Welcome, everybody. We are going to be talking about employment and education today. We're actually going to start with education because obviously that's vitally important to our ability to get employment. So let's dive in. Now, you've seen some of these slides before, but I just wanted to re-highlight these. Of course, looking at some of the research, we can look at longitudinal analyses, cross-sectional data, and we know that education is tied to both happiness as well as health. And higher education is associated with greater happiness, greater life satisfaction, and of course that cross-sectional data has been showing stronger predictor of health. The protective effects may be more modest than once thought, but we do see benefits to education when it comes to our health and happiness. And some of that research, of course, from the research out of Harvard was looking at that effect on virtue and character and really looking at those flourishing studies and finding that we see with education decreases in likelihood, of course, criminal activity, and increasing the likelihood of voting and democratic participation, which of course is great for that social cohesion and really taking part of our community. So education can affect many, many things. And of course, looking at some of the relationships between having purpose and marriage and finances. Of course, some of the evidence suggests that education and work experiences are associated with purpose in life. I know for me, my purpose in life is to help people. Part of because of where I've come from and my life before, and knowing that we can change. Knowing that we can change and wanting to help people with that. So my education, at least my education as an adult, really drove me towards my purpose in life. And of course, higher education is associated with more club membership, so we have more of that social interaction and social connection. We're more participatory in our communities, which of course helps to reduce that social isolation, which is so negatively affecting our health. So education supports all of that. And also we've talked a lot about the benefits of marriage, and education is associated with marriage. So increasing the probability of marriage might delay timing of the first marriage, which may end up allowing people to wait before they rush into things and have a longer lasting marriage, hopefully, and decreasing the likelihood of divorce. So education, again, is very, very powerful in our well-being, both emotionally, physically, financially, and of course, education is a strong predictor of our income. You saw this slide before as well, but I really wanted to just highlight this again because I just think it's a really nice flow chart showing how educational attainment affects so many different aspects in our lives, from our looking at the top, that health knowledge, literacy, and behaviors. We will talk a little bit about health literacy later in this talk, but this is a big one because if we don't have education and we can't understand how to read a label or take our medicine, I mean, there's some real negative, obviously dire even, consequences to some of these things. But we know that just even being able to read about health in general, about basic nutrition practices, how to exercise, all of these things are tied to our education attainment and our ability to manage our health and disease. And if you look at our ability to get work, of course, our working conditions are tied to our education based on the type of work we're able to get. We've talked about certain populations, if you have less education attainment, then it's harder to get jobs that may not have increased risk of exposure to hazardous materials. If you think of paint fumes or hazardous chemicals that people are exposed to with certain types of jobs versus somebody that's got a desk job. If you look at resources that are available, certain types of jobs are going to have greater benefits. We have more sick leave. The more education you have, even just starting a position. I know when I started jobs with a doctorate versus starting jobs with a bachelor's, I mean, I started with 3 weeks vacation. I didn't start with the PTO and everything sort of grouped together, I started with a lot of vacation. Well, at least in our country, what might be considered a lot of vacation, not compared to other countries, but that level of education really affects a lot of what we get. And having even health benefits with jobs. If we don't have full-time work, we don't get health benefits, and then we have to get health benefits, which can be incredibly costly. And if you have any kind of health conditions, the cost can be astronomical. And I've mentioned this even the first week. We pay in my family, because we are employed as independent contractors, and my husband and I both have our own businesses. It's very, very expensive for healthcare. And my daughter has pre-existing conditions. I have pre-existing conditions. So we're spending, thousands, literally thousands of dollars every month on just healthcare. And so, of course, our educational attainment, increasing the type of work, affecting the type of work, is going to hugely impact our income. Now, of course, there are those times where people create something with, they have a high school education, or some people have dropped out of high school and they strike it rich and they have a great idea. But obviously, those are few and far between. And if we don't have a substantial income or enough income, that affects our neighborhood choices, where we live. That affects the schooling our kids get. That affects the housing that we live in and the contaminants that may be in that environment, in that housing area, the nutrition availability, and then the stress. Of course, if we don't have the money to make ends meet, there's stress on, can we afford food? There's stress on, can we pay our rent? There's stress on maybe violence in the neighborhood. There's stress on, can I keep my house? There's so much added stress when our income is not supportive of our needs. And of course, all of that increasing stress, if we're looking at the negative side of this, and reducing our health. Now, of course, if you flip it and you've got a great education attainment, like you guys, finishing master's degrees opens up so many doors. And I know even in positions where people are looking at employers, when they're looking at applications and they're looking at resumes, a lot of times, just because they get so many, the weeding process, and those of you that may be in positions where you hire people, you just simply look initially, does this person have a college degree or not? And that's it. You don't even look any further than that. If they don't have a college degree, you put them in a pile and you don't even look. You just move on to those people that have the credential initially, and then you start evaluating their experience. So it's so hard to move forward, obviously, in jobs if you don't have that. So having education is so important. So vitally important to our health, and giving us the opportunities to take care of our health. If you've been watching, and hopefully you have been watching, The Unnatural Causes, they do a beautiful job of showing those two different choices, one that has a great job, has a good income, and the ability to take time to go for that run and take time to buy those healthy organic foods and all of those things that support health. And then, of course, the last flow chart there at the bottom of the image, educational attainment, sense of control. And we'll talk more about this today, but we look at that sense of control. That's a big one, because if we don't have that sense of control, if we're feeling like we have less autonomy in our workplace, if we don't have the ability to make decisions, if we're being overly micromanaged, it doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good, especially if we have talents and gifts and we can contribute. And if we're not using those, it takes away purpose and meaning in our lives, and it decreases the feeling of our value and our worth. So having that sense of control is very important in the workplace, and it does tie to health, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the studies looking at that as we move along today. And of course, social standing. The more education we have, that is tied to our social standing, not just the type of work that we can get, but also that social standing. There's a sense of accomplishment. There's a sense of pride, not only that we might feel for ourselves, but there's also we also get that from other people as well, and other people respecting that level of education that we have. And of course, that social standing can have a big impact on on how we interact with people in our community and our network that we have with people. And of course, that affects that social capital and that social cohesion. And then, of course, our educational attainment also affects social support. And we've talked a lot about that. Social support connection is so vitally important to our emotional as well as our physical health versus social isolation. And social attainment may help us to get more out into that community. We have more economic resources and health-related behaviors. We have more support to engage in those behaviors. We have more family stability. And if we have that family stability, we have that social network there, and that can reduce our stress. Of course, on the flip side, if we don't have that, then we see less of those resources, social economic resources. Health behaviors may not be supported in the same way. Family stability may not be there. We may not have that network to support us. And of course, all of that can increase stress and decrease our health versus the flip side that supports our health. Now, of course, we can look at education and its correlation with poverty. And of course, educational attainment protects families against poverty. And sometimes, when illness strikes, sicknesses can lead to problems with work. But for the most part, we know that education, of course, supports income and a good job and a secure job, and therefore helps to reduce the risk of poverty. And so you can see in our chart here, of course, that less than high school graduates in the left side of our bar chart here, we see that not graduating from high school, we have a poverty rate of 24% compared to 4% in families whose head of the household has a bachelor's degree or higher. So getting that education, particularly if we can go beyond high school and get that college degree and attain that college degree, preferably attaining that bachelor's degree or higher, as it is shown to be protective against poverty, which of course creates more stress and ill health. Now, looking at early childhood development, this is a really important area. So of course we see that the developmental and educational opportunities that kids have from a very early age has lasting effects on health as adults. And this is why you see a lot more commercials today on TV showing, to have preschool, and they'll show the child go from preschool to elementary to high school to college and to having a great job, or they start at that end point and then they reflect back, showing how all of these things make a difference. And of course, we've talked about that first five and those campaigns, first five, really important of getting that early childhood development. And when we look at some of the research, there's a project or a study that was that looked at children, and in the study they were looking at participation in high quality and comprehensive early childhood education programs, and this can include nutrition, this can include healthcare, and they found that it led to better health compared to those that were not involved in the early high quality childhood development. And so the study found that when they looked at the participants at age 21, the people who had participated in these comprehensive education programs, they actually had fewer risky behaviors, risky health behaviors. So less binge drinking, less smoking, less illegal drug use. All of these things were reduced in the people that had an early childhood development program. And the group also, when they self-reported health, they self-reported that they had better health and they had lower numbers, and there were lower numbers of deaths in these groups. So this early childhood development programs are really important. And you can think of some like the Head Start program. A lot of you may have heard of the Head Start program, and this is a really great program. It really targets people even before 5 years old, so really young, getting that first head start, really a head start, just like the name implies, head start, because it gives us kind of a leg up when we get this. And they also looking at later in life, so looking at people in their mid-30s who had participated in comprehensive educational programs or these early childhood development programs, they also found that they had lower risk of heart disease and they had lower risk factors for heart disease. So things like obesity, high blood pressure, elevated blood sugar, elevated cholesterol, these were all things that were reduced in people that had had early childhood development programs. And these studies, they also show that quality in early childhood development programs can play a really big role, a key role in reducing, again, healthy or increasing healthy behaviors, reducing those lifestyle choices that can increase the risk of chronic disease and leading to future well-being. So some of the things, again, that we see also in this early childhood development programs are that the children who are healthy and developmentally ready to get started in kindergarten. So we know when kids go to preschool, they're better prepared. So early development could be preschool, could be some of these other educational programs, but they're better prepared for kindergarten. And of course, even just at that level, going into meeting those requirements for kindergarten can have a huge impact. So meeting academic performance goals, that early education and going into kindergarten, starting kindergarten, ready to start kindergarten, I should say, can impact reaching goals even in later years in elementary school. They're associated with graduating high school. So again, starting kindergarten already ready for that affects our ability to graduate high school and becoming healthy adults, having and competing for higher paying jobs. Also allowing us to have less reliance on some of these other social services during our lifetime. So again, preparing children at a young age to be able even to enter kindergarten has an effect on us throughout our lives. And so research also shows that children who receive high quality early care and education are also less likely to repeat a grade. They're less likely to need special education services. They're less likely to get in trouble with the law at school or with the law, and they are more likely to get a college degree. They're a little over 4.5 times more likely to get a college degree, again, just because of getting good quality early care as a child. And they're more likely to earn up to $2,000 more per month than people that didn't get that early care. So, when you start thinking about this, we start thinking from that public health perspective. What are the programs that are out there? What can we do to get more programs out there to everybody? That equality for everybody. Everybody deserves to get this. And we need to create policies. We need to create programs and get government backing to pay for these programs to get them out there to all children so that we do have that upper leg. We do have that head start. There are also programs that are they're often called booster programs. And what they do is they kind of go beyond the traditional comprehensive childhood development programs, and they add other aspects like social services to really complement the early childhood and kindergarten programs. And what's beautiful about these is they also can help the parents. And we look at some of the characteristics, things that these have. Of course, they create these low student-teacher ratios. They focus on basic skills. They have good teacher training. They have the school parent liaisons. They have school meals, provisions for transportation to and from school, night courses for parents. healthcare services and referrals, home visitation, and these supportive social services. So if we can get more of these, again, this goes to, some grassroots but public policy, and getting more help to people that are in need of these services and need that support. I mean, how wonderful is this? It's so hard being a parent, especially if you don't have that social network and you need childcare. Who do you go to? You don't want to just leave your kids with anybody. It's really challenging. And I know I'm so fortunate because my husband's family is all here and we have this network, and he's got several siblings, and we've got nieces and nephews that are, college age that can help us, and we have that network. My sister, she was a single parent, and she was on her own in a city where there was no family and very few good friends. So it's really, really challenging. So programs like this can be incredibly supportive of not only helping the children to develop and thrive, but also the parents. And of course, if the parents are happy, I had a patient that I used to work with in cardiac rehab, and she would always say, if mama ain't happy, nobody's happy. And, we as parents, we need to be balanced because we want to provide that balance and decrease stress reactivity to our children as well. So when we look at some of the big benefits of really investing in that childhood development, it's one, it can prevent the achievement gap. So we know that kids that get this Head Start, they have more abilities throughout life to achieve and to get jobs and to have jobs that are secure and to make more money and to have better health, have more cognitive and social skills throughout their life. Two, we can improve health outcomes. Again, research shows, and one of the studies, or some of the research, is by Dr. Heckman, and they've shown dramatic long-term health effects of those early interventions, particularly looking at even disadvantaged children that have been able to get some of this early education, nutrition, health, all of these things. Even 30 years later, the treatment groups of these individuals were significantly lower risk of serious cardiovascular disease, metabolic disease, so diabetes, stroke, in addition to metabolic syndrome. We'll talk a little bit about some of this research as we move through, with work attainment. And of course, the findings, they show the great potential of coordinated, birth to age 5, early childhood programs to prevent chronic disease, reduce healthcare costs, and produce flourishing in our societies. And that, to me, again, is what it's all about. We want to produce flourishing. And the sooner we can get to kids, the better, the better. And of course, we also see that the third big benefit of investing in these early childhood developments, and again, I see this as public health. It's public health. We got to create more policies to get this. And you look at some of the studies, again, by Professor Heckman and other top researchers around the world. It's not just in the United States, but all around the world, that have been finding that these, extremely disadvantaged children who took part in early interventional studies, and some of the research looking at Jamaica, but they found that similar to home visiting programs in the United States, really boosted the earnings in the adults. So again, going back to early childhood Head Start, they found that it boosted earnings by about 25%. Putting their wages on par with those of more advantaged peers. So even though they were in disadvantaged situations, because of these programs, these early start programs, these early childhood development programs, they were to be on par with people that had more advantages. So these programs are so important. And of course, number 4, that fourth big benefit of investing in these programs is it makes sense from a financial perspective. The rate of return of investment of these programs, these quality educational childhood development programs for disadvantaged children, is somewhere between about 7 to 10% per annum through better outcomes in education, through sociability, economic productivity, reduced crime, and improved health. So it just makes sense. An area of concern with education is basically this social gap, this gap that has been growing over the years. And Stanford sociologist Sean Reardon, in a landmark study, demonstrated this widening of this class gap. And we see this in both reading and math test scores in kids in the United States over the recent decades. And he has summarized his findings by saying the achievement gap between children from high and low income families is about 30 to 40% larger, 30 to 40% larger in kids born in 2001 compared to those born 25 years earlier. And that's scary because it just points that we are going in the wrong direction and that there is greater divide. And in fact, this class gap has actually been growing within each racial group, while the gap between racial groups has actually been narrowing. And it's thought, looking at this, the 21st century, that this class gap in students entering kindergarten was 2 to 3 times greater than the racial gap. So this is really, really important. And in some of his findings, Reardon's findings, they're really important because academic achievement is, of course, measured by test scores. It's a dominant contributor to class disparity later in life, such as college graduation, incarceration, and, of course, our adult earnings. As we look at research, quantitative research has consistently shown that this wide difference in these academic outcomes between schools that are attended by affluent kids and schools that have more impoverished children. There is, again, this widening gap. And so there's this term residential sorting. So basically it's rich and poor Americans are increasingly living in separate neighborhoods. And most of the kids attend schools that are near their home. So most people go to the school in their neighborhood. Of course, some people go to private schools, or they might go to a different charter school or something, but for the most part, most people go to the schools that are within their neighborhood, the private, or not the private necessarily, but the public schools that are within their neighborhood. So people search out neighborhoods now, a lot of the time, for their kids. So I know moving into the neighborhood I live in, we have really, our elementary school is really good, and it was a top rated school. That's something that was really important to me. I know before I had kids, I had friends that were having kids, and they would move to neighborhoods that they could get, fantastic, really great public school education for their kids. At a private school level, not all private schools are good, but you move to a neighborhood that's going to have good schools. So we see this residential sorting by income, and this really over the last 30 to 40 years has sent high income and really kind of separated that high income and low income students into different school systems. So school quality may help to explain some of the increasing residential segregation as, again, parents decide where to live based on the school system. And we see upper class parents or higher income earning parents, higher education attaining parents that have better information about schools. They may know more about the neighborhoods. They may have more ability to choose where they live because of the income bracket they're in and their ability to get to and from work. And so that makes a huge difference. And Jonathan Rothwell, and he's of the Brookings Institute, found that houses near a high-scoring public school cost more than about $200,000 more than a comparable house in a lower-scoring school neighborhood. I don't know if I said that very clearly, but basically the housing, of course, if it's a good school neighborhood, even if the housing is really similar, it's going to cost more. And so I've heard this term, and I don't know if you've ever heard this, but somebody said it was called the braces test. And so it's looking at, if you're going through a neighborhood, if you're looking at the schools, you're looking at the kids, how many of the kids have braces? So you can start to see, and of course some people will look at cars and the type of cars, but they'll judge neighborhoods by some of these things that show, okay, people have enough money to pay for this. And this process leads to advantaged kids being with other advantaged kids in one set of schools, and poor kids being with other poor kids in another set of schools. And so lower income families may be less informed and have other constraints such as transportation, child care problems that more advantaged families don't have to deal with. And as we continue looking at some of this class-based segregation, nearly universally across developed countries, we see kids do better in schools where other kids, when they come from affluent or educated homes, regardless of their family background. So somebody, if they get into a more affluent school through, it could be that they get a scholarship of some sort, or they get into a really good charter school, or whatever it might be. The kids that end up in these schools, and this is not me talking, this is research showing that they do better. So the social composition of the student body in a school has an impact on achievement, again, independent of the student's own social background. So it's very important, and this affects test scores, it affects graduation rates, it affects college enrollment, and even, of course, adult income. So the school that we go to makes a difference. And researchers haven't found the school finances really to be the biggest predictor of this. What's really interesting when you look at some of this research is a lot of these schools, these public schools anyway, they may get the same amount of funding coming in because the district is going to allocate money to each school. But where you see some of the big differences is in the after-school programs, the additional computers, the additional resources that more affluent schools get because of the parent involvement. And also just the parent involvement in general, not just from the financial contributions they may be making. And I mentioned this the first week of class. I know at our school, my kids are at a public school, but oh my gosh, they're always asking for money. They're always asking for money, and we have auctions, and we have all of these fundraisers to get money, or we're donating, and we donated a couple Chromebooks to the school. So there's and a lot of the parents are doing this. So yeah, we've got all of these extracurricular activities, and these more affluent schools may have, even public schools may have 100 extracurricular activities versus a public school that's in a lower socioeconomic neighborhood, that they don't have the backing from the parents putting all this money, and maybe even having the time to volunteer in the schools to run some of these. I was just talking to somebody today, and she had a volunteer. She volunteers at the school in her neighborhood. It's not her kid's school, but just she volunteers and she teaches problem solving, creative problem solving. And so, it's having people that are involved, as well as that financial piece, that are providing these schools with the upper leg. Again, a greater head start. Of course, we're talking, if you're moving into high school, of course, this is, all these extracurriculars, and having people involved in some of these keeps people out of trouble too. So it's not just what's being, how the district is dispersing of money, and a lot of times these schools are getting even more counselors, and they're getting high quality teachers. So that's not the issue, but part of it is because of this class gap, is that these affluent schools these kids are getting so much more opportunity than other kids. Now I want to jump into high school. Of course, looking at inequalities, we were talking about that social gap, and this is sort of an example of a couple high schools, and there's Orange County has a lot of great data. I love it. They have so much good material around a lot of this, actually around a lot of aspects of social determinants of health in general. But this is looking at a couple different high schools that are within Orange County that are not too far apart. And there's Troy High School in Fullerton and Santa Ana High School. And the districts, basically they spend about the same. So as I was saying, some of these schools you can look and they're getting from the school district, which controls again spending, we're seeing spending per pupil that's comparable. Student to teacher ratios that is pretty similar. The teacher quality based on their formal education and experience is comparable. And the number of guidance counselors is similar. Oftentimes in the lower socioeconomic schools, they may even have more. But when we go back to looking at a school that is a little bit more privileged in a higher socioeconomic neighborhood, a more affluent neighborhood, they have, again, many more of those extracurriculars. The private funding that's raised leads to a lot of the discrepancies or the disparities that we see. So inequalities in the schools, of course, when we look at student populations at these schools, they're very different, vastly different. We see the poverty rates are different, ethnic backgrounds, English proficiency, physical fitness, academics, and SAT scores are going to be typically lower in the more impoverished neighborhood. The Troy High School, again, the more affluent school, is ethnically diverse. It is also economically, has more economically upscale backgrounds. Parents have higher education levels, of course, higher incomes. We see the test scores are higher. SAT scores on average are somewhere between, like in the top 10 to 15%. And you contrast this with the school. And again, when you break it down and you look at some of the effects, again, teacher quality, the amount that's coming in from the district, a lot of these things on paper look the same until you look at more of the details. And so the Santa Ana High School has more poor kids, has more Latinos, more Spanish speaking. So this is a big issue too when you have schools that have non-English speaking, and you have a lot of non-English speaking and people that aren't learning the English language. Of course, you're going to take all your tests in English, so it makes a difference. 4 times more likely to be truant or have suspensions. A third is likely to even take the SAT. And those that do take the SAT on average score in the bottom quartile nationwide. Now, when we look at this from a health perspective, we know, as we've talked about, of course, educational attainment has a profound effect on both our emotional and our physical well-being later in life. When you look at students, when we're specifically looking at high school, when kids aren't graduating high school, the dropouts, students who drop out of high school, they experience more poor health and they experience premature death more. They are at greater risk for that. And individuals who don't graduate high school, they are also more likely to self-report poor health. So they may be living with chronic health conditions. For example, research suggests that we'll see more asthma, diabetes, heart disease, elevated blood pressure, stroke, hepatitis, stomach ulcers in students that have not graduated high school compared to those who have graduated from high school. So even just high school graduation, that makes a big difference. And of course, ultimately, finishing more years of high school, the more they attain, even if they didn't finish, but the more they attain, the more protective it is. So staying in school as long as possible is really, really, really important. And programs that encourage high school completion can improve the graduation rates of high school students and, of course, also the community. So having that community is, and giving back into the community is really important. And increased educational attainment provides individuals, of course, with opportunities to create higher income and have better access to better living conditions, having better access to healthier foods, having better access to healthcare services. All of these, of course, going back to protecting our health and decreasing the risk of all of those conditions that we see when people drop out of high school. And so overall, graduating from high school has the potential to improve population health. It has the ability to improve population health. So when we talk public health, I know it sounds like we're just talking about education, and don't the educators just take care of education? Aren't they the ones that look at this? But this is a public health issue because it increases the risk of so many different disease states and poor health. And so research consistently shows that employment prospects and lifelong earning potential are higher, of course, in people that have graduated at least from high school. And for every year of high school that a student completes, for every year that they complete, their lifetime wealth increases by 15%. So if somebody, drops out as a freshman versus dropping out as maybe a senior, what they're going to be able to attain is going to be much different in life, even if they didn't finish. So we need to have these programs in school. What can we do, and what do we need to do to help people? If they've had trauma, we need things in place. That Paper Tigers movie documentary is great, and you see that they even have health centers at the campus that kids can go to. So there's so much that's increasing the availability of these resources and having those programs so that we can increase resilience is so important. So what are some things that you can do? You can support school-based health centers, become a champion for school-based health centers it could be around the Pacific, could be around the community near the university, or in your own neighborhood or another neighborhood. If you use some of those resources where you can look at different locations and different communities and see where communities are underserved, and really go to make a difference. And we know that more families could still benefit from these types of services that are out there. And you can find whether there is a school, or if maybe even the high school that you went to, or elementary, whatever it is, but looking to see where you can make a difference and becoming a mentor. And this is such a wonderful thing to do. I've told you I do for free. I teach a class. I teach an 8-week program at my church, and we're going to start opening it up to younger people because I've had so many of the participants saying, "Gosh, our kids need this. Our teens need this. They desperately need this." And so we're going to start opening it up to have a group for younger kids. And I do this out of 2-hour classes, 2 to 2.5, sometimes 3, depending on how much discussion there is, every weekend for 8 weeks. And it's so rewarding. It's so rewarding. And becoming a mentor, we all have so much to offer from wherever our lives have been and where they are now. We have so much to give back, and being that adult, having that positive adult relationship is so critical. Having that one person in your life. I know for me, and I'll bring it back to this a lot because it's my own personal story, but it's why I'm so passionate about this work. I grew up in a not so happy household, and I almost didn't finish college. I almost didn't survive. And when I look at this, I want to give back. I'm turned my pain and my blame into purpose in making a difference, because I know people can change, because I did. Okay, I almost didn't graduate high school. I was almost one of those statistics that I've just been talking about. And then I ended up graduating college with honors. I got the Dean's Award in graduate school. I got the Dean's Award for my doctoral program. And I was told my whole life I was an idiot and that I was stupid. I needed one person. We just need one person. And one of the reasons I'm so passionate when I talk about these things is, as public health professionals and getting stuff into the school systems, is that there were people that knew. There were people that knew, but people didn't do anything. And I don't know if it's that they didn't know what to do, but we can make a difference. And I want us to turn any pain into purpose, and power. And so giving back and being a mentor is such a wonderful thing to be able to do, to really cultivate and provide whether it's kids or whether it's teens or whether it's adults, is to be that positive relationship, that positive adult reminder that can really change the trajectory of somebody's life, really, truly. And I know that was what happened for me. I had one person that really turned my life around. So we want to, if also getting involved in the local community. For example, contact your local school or after school programs and ask if they need volunteers. And there are actually services online, and I'll try to see if I can find, I get emails from it regularly, but that actually I get emails from volunteer things. Like every couple weeks, I get an email and it says, okay, these are volunteer openings near my community or within my community. And there's so many things going on, from, helping with puppies to helping, the homeless. So there's a lot of different opportunities that we can get out. And when we volunteer, it's good for us too. So we do see the physical and emotional benefits from that when we get out there and volunteer. Maybe it's coaching a sports club, volunteering at a kids program, or going to the local library, or tutoring organization. If there's something that you've overcome in your life, get out there and share that. And if you have passion about cooking, get out there and teach cooking in the community. Whatever it is that can support the community. And it doesn't have to be overwhelming. Everybody's busy, but even if it's just occasionally, like I don't teach my class every single, it's not an ongoing every 2 months, every 2 months. I do it, I space it out, and I fit it into my schedule when I can, and I try to do it a couple times a year. But again, really rewarding to give back and to help. Another area that's of concern is the types of classes that people are taking. Even if they have opportunities to possibly take some of these AP classes, for example, in this statistic here, we have the 60% are not participating in any of the AP science courses, and they have the potential to do it. Now, part of this could be, some of it is around mindset. Some of it could be around the community that they're involved in, and the friends that they might be around that might, have a negative look on studying and high scholastic achievement. But 60% aren't participating in these things that can help them to get into college, and not only help them get into college, but be prepared once they get into college. And in each graduating class, hundreds of thousands demonstrate high potential for success in these AP science classes, and they're not taking them. So 40% participate in the recommended AP Science course. So, what do we do? How do we get people to become open to these classes if they're available? Well, I think some of that could come back to looking at that mindset. Does the individual have the mindset to take these courses? And can we get these programs into schools? Can we have teachers bringing these aspects of mindset, growth mindset, compassion, because teachers can get trained in all of these things. Mindfulness, compassion, gratitude, all of these things can have an impact on elementary school. There's quite a lot of research, and high school students as well as college students. From any age, this stuff can help us. But when the brain is still developing, what a prime opportunity to be able to create change. So if it's something that somebody is feeling like they can't do it, they have that learned helplessness, and they think that they can't do it. And I know that was me. I didn't believe I could do it. I didn't believe I could do it. So I didn't even try. And we want to change the mindset. We want to change the narrative, and getting teachers to learn some of these tools and to recognize them, again, to see not only the potential that the students can have, but also to recognize when there's something that's taking them from reaching their potential, whether it's trauma or something else. So this is just a couple charts, a couple bar graphs here that you can see based on income. On the left-hand side, it's looking strictly at family income and graduation rates. So when we look at the income down towards the bottom, obviously you can see the higher the income, the greater chance of, for the most part, of course, the highest one dips, you know, a tiny bit down from the 100,000 to 149,999, but what we see is that trend of moving towards higher income, higher graduation rate. And then, of course, looking at the graph on the right, we also are seeing, based on family income, based on the top, the third, the second, and the bottom quartiles, and then the high school graduation rates. And so you can see this is also broken down by race, ethnicity. So we have the white, non-Hispanic in the blue, black in the yellow, Asian in the green, and Hispanic in the purple. And so we see, of course, it's just kind of another representation. I just like seeing it by race. But of course, as the income goes down, we see that the graduation rates decline. And if you look at that bottom quartile, you see that the in this particular study, the Hispanics with the lower income had the fewest or the lowest graduation rates. Asians had the highest. So just kind of interesting to look at that representation. Now moving on to college. Here is a couple similar graphs. And this is looking at college continuation by income and race and ethnicity. So we see a very similar pattern. If you look on the left, you'll see, of course, those going on to college increases with income. And then if you look on the right, you see some similar ranges looking at, of course, that top quartile, third, second, and then the bottom quartile by income, and then the college continuation rate. And of course, this graph, the one thing that jumps out to me, of course, you still see that same trend as going down, but we see that those going in, when we look at that bottom quartile, we see that the Hispanic population in this group is a little bit higher in moving forward into college. And then, of course, we see clearly the Asian bar is jumping out really ahead of everybody else here in moving towards whichever group they were in, whichever quartile they were in for family income, they were more likely to continue on to college. And here we have the estimated bachelorette degree attainment. So those that are completing their bachelor's degree, and this is looking from the 1970s to 2015. So pretty recent data here. What's really great is that you see increases in all groups, whether it's that top income quartile or the bottom. We've seen a trend moving upwards, and that more people are finishing and attaining that degree, which is wonderful because we know that is protective of health, right? But we still see a huge discrepancy when we look at income. So you see from the top income quartile in 2015, almost 60% completing the degree, versus 12% in the bottom income. So of course, you just think about all the things that you have to go through to earn that degree. You know, having to work full time, and I have worked full time when I was in school, and I also had a time where I didn't have to do that, and holy moly, it's a big difference when you don't have to work full time and go to school. Those of you that have done both, you know that it's vastly different working full time and even part time compared to somebody that has the finances that they don't have to work at all. Although I think working is really good, especially if you can put into practice a lot of the skills or the things that you're learning in school and you get that practical experience, I think is fantastic. But it definitely makes it you know, harder. And here, looking at that completion of a bachelor's degree by generation. So if somebody was a first generation or not a first generation person going towards college, I thought that was really interesting. And it was also, of course, this is based on income. So on the left-hand side, you see the low-income first generation, followed by low-income not first generation, and then first generation not low income, and then on the right, the bar is not low income and not first generation. So we see that somebody that's not first generation will tend to have a greater chance of completing college, and then whether they're low income or not low income, either way. So those second generations or beyond have a greater chance of completing college. And of course, if you have family members or parents that have gone to college, there's more push to do that. And it makes it a little bit easier, and especially if you have people that expect it and believe that you can do it, makes it a heck of a lot easier to move forward and complete that degree, especially during those difficult times. There's also some interesting data looking at for-profit universities like University of Phoenix, Kaplan, compared to the nonprofit universities. And it's really interesting because what they found is there's enrollment has gone from the early 90s of about 2% full-time undergraduates up to about 13% more recently. And what they're also seeing is the lower income students are enrolling more. So they also see older and more ethnic minorities, but there's a disproportionate amount of lower income backgrounds. And I think this is wonderful on the one hand, that more people are entering colleges and they're finding that these institutions, based on how they run the classes, and they're able to take a certain amount at a time, and it works better with working schedules for some people. But there are a couple negatives here, is that the graduation rates tend to be lower, and the for-profit institutions are twice as expensive as public universities, or approximately that. And they also have worse records in terms of the again, graduation rates, but also employment rates and earnings. So that's obviously a negative when it comes to health, because we know less earnings, less employment, and of course not graduating all contribute to poor health outcomes, physical and emotional. They also see that the students end up with higher debt. Of course, the cost is higher, and then they have higher default rates. So there are some negatives to this as well. Of course, enrolling in college is fantastic, but it's finishing college that provides the benefit, really, or greater benefit, I should say. This is another couple graphs I thought were interesting. When you look at us in the United States compared to other countries, we see that back in 2003, those that were attaining that, they say, tertiary degree, so beyond high school, so getting like a college degree, for example, we were number 2 back in 2003, and in 2012 we've dropped down to number 12. So I'm not going to say anything else about this, but just that that's really interesting to me. So it might be interesting to do some research and look as to why we're going down on that scale compared to some other countries. But one of the things we might want to look at is it because of the financial costs of college today? My goodness, I can't believe how much college costs today. When I started college, it was affordable. I mean, you could pay for it without, having to go in incredible debt. Now, of course, private universities have always cost more, but even today, compared to what I was paying when I was at Loma Linda, which wasn't cheap, but compared to what I paid, I mean, the prices just in everything have just gone up so high. And then, of course, you just are left with such debt. I have huge debt from Loma Linda. I think I'll be paying for the rest of my life. Hopefully not, but the debt is huge. But I think it was worth it. Absolutely, I would never take it back. So I'll take on that burden. But the financial need analysis model, we look at what about getting people financial aid? And so these are all the things that are looked at, of course, cost of attendance, the tuition, the room and board, the books, the supplies, personal and medical care, transportation, and then looking at the expected family contribution, which this to me is always really challenging because you may have a family that has a decent income, but they also have huge debt. So they're literally, working paycheck to paycheck, and that's, I would say, probably more of the country than not. And so when they look at those values, it's still very challenging to come up with the tuition to pay for college. As parents, it's terrifying to me because I can't even imagine how much it's going to cost when my kids go to college. And then, of course, looking at that equal the financial need, grants, scholarships, and earnings from work study, education loans, and all that. So looking at the right-hand side of this slide, restoring college affordability. So, I think this is going to come back to some of that policy. I think people, on some sides of politics saying we need free education for everybody. Now it sounds fantastic. I would love for my children to get a free education, free college. That would be wonderful. I don't see that happening anytime soon. And of course, you take something, you give somewhere else. So something else is going to give if we are able to do that, is my guess. But this is just looking at some of those things. So what are the things that may be prohibiting or decreasing somebody even enrolling in higher education, enrolling in whether it's community college, what have you. And I'm really referring more towards college here, but or four-year college, but even still, either way. We see, of course, the social context with which the student is a part of, so their beliefs about higher education. Again, I mentioned if parents have gone to college, and that's big, not only because of the parents' knowledge and experience, but the parents can help them navigate the whole college admissions process, writing the essays, taking the SATs, and talking about how important all of those things are. The academic expectations of the parents, making really informed decisions about education. So the parents, and then of course the context with which, again, the child has grown up, have a big influence on whether they even move forward to enrolling in college. And first-generation college students, we were talking about first-generation college students, or are they graduating college? But they may not have advantages because, again, the parental knowledge and experience isn't there. But they may still have that parental support, that real strong encouragement. I know my husband's family came from Nicaragua, and they spoke very, really not a lot of English when they came here. And my husband, he and his siblings, they were sort of on their own in high school. They knew, but their parents were very, very supportive of education, very strongly supported education. And they knew that that's when they got home, they did their homework. And luckily, they were all pretty bright kids too, and they were very self-sufficient and they got things done. But they had very strong motivation from their parents to focus on studying and do well. And also institutional aspects, public funding for colleges has been decreasing, and that leads to increased tuition rates. That leads to increased student debt. So there's real challenges around that and real fears around that. And really, despite having federal loans that students can get, it's not a super easy process. There's a lot of complexities to find the financial aid process that can end up leading people to just be done with it and not move forward. So these are all things that people really need some help with, from whether they're getting that outside support from maybe family members, but having good counselors that can navigate and help people And having good counselors. I know college isn't for everybody, and we need to look at trajectories of what people can do and where they want to go. But I was one of those that was told, oh, you can't do college. College, well, they said it nicely, but college may not be for you. College may not be for you. And look at where I ended up. So they were clearly wrong. But I think that we need to have good counselors, good career counselors, but it isn't for everybody. It really isn't. But we need to have people that can really navigate and see where is somebody coming from and why is it that maybe they don't look like they should be on that path. And college admissions policies may prevent students who need remedial education and enrollment. And this is another issue. So if there's actually a pretty decent amount of people that need some of those remedial classes going into college, and that could potentially delay graduation. Of course, then you start thinking about the costs of everything. And some people need assistance, just adjusting to college, selecting courses, and having that guidance. And if you don't have it coming from family or friends or of course it's harder to navigate. Looking at enrollment, there are also barriers research has seen in racial and ethnic minorities. And these different barriers that they face. For example, African Americans and Hispanic individuals have lower college enrollments and graduation rates compared to white individuals. And the Latino individuals are most likely to attend college part-time. And when we attend college part-time, that actually reduces the odds of graduating. So if somebody has to work full-time and they can only go to college part-time, again, the chances of finishing are reduced. And part of that, it takes longer, and as you guys know, being in college, it takes a lot longer if you go part-time. And then it just gets hard. And then there are other factors, of course, that contribute. One study found that 3 in 4 Latino college students were not academically prepared for the coursework. So you think about some of those AP classes and things we were just talking about. If we don't have some of that more rigorous academic preparation, it does make it a little harder as we enter college. And there's also evidence looking at African American college students. They tend to accumulate more federal education debt than other ethnicities. But even with this, can be good because the loans help to increase the likelihood that they're enrolling and graduating. Some of the different types of institutions that minority students attend can also be a barrier. So there was a study that was looking at African American students attending predominantly white universities or colleges, and they found that as opposed to African American students going to the predominantly black colleges, they found that there was more stress related to discrimination, racial discrimination at the more predominantly white universities. And some minority students attending these more white universities, they also, in addition to experiencing some of the discrimination, there's that isolating piece. So they start to feel some more or experience more social isolation, which of course we've talked about how negative that can be. We need that connection. We desperately need that connection. But colleges can provide, of course, programs, which would be great if we have more minority students that build social and cultural programs and build that social capital. We've talked about a number of barriers to moving towards higher education or finishing higher education, but there are strategies, of course, strengthening curriculum in the primary and secondary schools, getting programs for kids that could change their mindset, resilience, all of those things. Peer-to-faculty mentoring can help students to apply for school, learn how to get the financial aid. So the high schools, the counselors, we really need good ones. I mentioned this already, but to really help students to navigate this process, particularly if they're first generation and they don't have that family support around this. And also feeling that sense of community, building that sense of community for the student, and expanding access to scholarships and financial aid, and furthering research. The more research, those of you that are going to go into research, having more research around this and really showing that how it affects health and reducing those health disparities is really important. And the more we start to get some more of this additional evidence out there, it's going to facilitate those public health efforts. It's going to help to address that higher education and those social determinants of health, and start creating some programs and policy. Now, whether somebody goes into a four-year university or somebody goes to a community college, there are skills that need to be taught in the universities. Now, this goes back all the way to, elementary school and high school as well, but research has looked at and drawn on research from economics, and they have found that there are these general 4 characteristics. And you can add in the 5th characteristic of character, but the things that we need to be successful in this, global economy that are critical for this have been called the 21st century skills, and that's communication. So we need to teach people how to better communicate, collaboration, how to work together, and creativity. And that's one of the things I love about the growth mindset movement is that it really helps to foster some of this creative thinking and taking chances to brainstorm and to come up with things kind of outside of the box, and just focusing on that process. So that critical thinking, and then of course character. And I love the aspect of adding that character, because we need, it's ethics, it's caring about the people that we're working with, whether it's students that we're working with in a group or whether it's in a business meeting, but it's working with others. And this can be started, of course, even starting to teach these skills in preschool and in very early education, elementary school, teaching these skills so that, even by the time somebody gets to college, they have more of these skills and this this mindset, so to speak, to be able to succeed in school and then, of course, after. So I believe we need to create more change. And I think one of those things that I've talked about last week and I've talked about today quite a bit is that growth mindset versus that fixed mindset. This is something that can be trained. We can learn this. And again, I'll go back to that power of yet. I've posted a video that I want you to watch. One of the researchers that has been kind of spearheaded this research and getting this out to schools. They have a lot of different programs that can be adopted by educators, but also some of these programs that can be adopted into the home, and I'll share some of that with you. But this really moving people towards this growth mindset of analyzing mistakes, accepting challenges, the ability to learn new things, inspired by other success, versus that fixed mindset that's unchangeable, that we avoid challenges, avoid failure, and give up easily. So students from lower income families are less likely to hold that growth mindset than wealthier peers, but those who did hold a growth mindset seem to have a buffer. We talked about the social buffer. We were talking about children and the other week, but that buffer and so they have this buffer against the effects of poverty and achievement. So this is where you start to see maybe this can help lead to that resilience and why some people are so resilient in the midst of challenge. And this is one of the videos, the power of yet. Again, I just love this. I love reframing. Let's reframe to the positive as much as we can. No matter where we've been, we can change. And that power of yet. I may not be there yet. I may not have that skill yet, but we can learn. Now you'll see this in the video, but part of this power of yet, part of this growth mindset is really not just focusing on sort of the self-esteem movement, which we've talked about in the research, looking at how self-compassion appears to really help us a lot, where the self-esteem movement has sort of let us down. And when we look at this growth mindset research, it really seems to fall in line, to me, a lot with that self-compassion research. And it's not just focusing on the, praising the kid or the person, because as adults, we can do this too. Again, we can change our mindsets as well, but we're praising and giving reward for effort, for strategy, for progress, not just having the right answers. Now, of course, we need to be able to come up with right answers, but we want to focus on that process, the strategy, and really reward that, because when we reward that, it helps people to engage more. It helps people to do more. It helps people to not have so much fear around not getting the right answer, especially if somebody has some of those negative self-concepts of not being smart or not being good enough. Then this is a process that can really help them to start to change that. And it can help to increase that perseverance. So, when we looking at being able to change the kids' mindset, part of it, and I've got another slide that talks a little bit about some of the curriculum in some of these growth mindset courses, and they basically, they teach the kids that as they push themselves, as they push out of their comfort zone, so right or wrong, just pushing out of that comfort zone, their neurons are going to form new connections, stronger connections that's going to help make them smarter. So even by just doing this process, it shows them that they can change through that process of neuroplasticity, positive neuroplasticity. And students are taught that, even if they'd had declining grades, the kids that had low grades or were disadvantaged, they saw improvements in these kids that were taught this growth mindset practice, versus kids that didn't get that. We saw the researchers continued to see some declines in grades. So the mindset group really showed improvements. And this has been seen in thousands of kids, especially struggling kids. So what this shows us, and she says this in the video too, but it helps with that equality that we've been talking about. We see that class gap, that social gap, that income gap. And we see that, even if somebody is in a lower socioeconomic group, and some of the research has been done in kids in Harlem, fourth graders that were in the 95th percentile in the nation achievement test, and they shot up to #1 in math test scores in just a year. Kids on reservations, Native American reservations, they also saw significant improvements, even beating out kids in areas of affluence, like around Seattle, and Microsoft kids. They found that they didn't care. A lot of the kids in the Native American study, they found that they didn't care just about getting smarter at first. That wasn't like a big deal for them. But then when they started talking about meaning, I think sort of that we were talking about meaning and purpose, and how that's such a big part of flourishing, meaning and purpose. So when they gave cultural meaning to these children, it could help their family, their community, and they could contribute. That's when these kids took off with this. And of course, getting parents and teachers involved, and the students began believing in the potential. They believed their potential was unlimited. And that's what we want for our kids. That's what we want for our adults too, to have that belief and to know that we can change no matter where we are. Here's the chart kind of looking at that fixed versus growth mindset from the intervention, or from one of the interventions. So in the first couple sessions, they do start talking about the brain, and they talk about the structure and the function, some of the brain anatomy, and they'll talk about how, again, how is that, it can change that process. Think of that process of neuroplasticity in the next couple weeks. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but they go through this whole process, and they provide skills, they provide, training, discussion, and they succeed. The kids learn, and they respond to the science, and that they start to believe that they're not cooked. They're not cooked. They can still change. And it's just really heartwarming and inspiring. Here's a graph from one of the studies looking at the intervention with math grades, and showing that the experimental group, of course, the group that was getting that growth mindset program, had improvements in their math grades. And this slide and the next one are just looking at the mindset assessment. Of course, this is a validated research assessment that has been used in people of 12 and over, and it's been used in quite a lot of studies, and I've got one of the questionnaires, or the questionnaire, on the next slide. So it's basically, again, just going to assess if somebody has that growth mindset or that fixed mindset. And I'm just going to read the first question, is no matter how intelligent you are, you can always change it a good deal. So it's basically based on a disagree a lot versus agree a lot. And here's their website, The Mindset Works, and they have a list of all of the programs that they have. This is the one that I mentioned. They have some for home called Brainiology, and they've got research behind these programs. And so this is, of course, there's a fee here, but some of these are being adopted into school settings. And changing the mindset isn't just about academics. In this particular study, the researchers actually found that we can change students' mindsets in non-academic areas and actually have an impact on a range of behaviors. And this particular study was looking at things like pro-social behavior. So we want pro-social behavior. It contributes to our happiness, and not just our happiness, but of course helps us with our whole community, and then we create this positive cycle. And what about prayer in education? Now, of course, in the public schools, we're not going to have prayer, but we can still teach our kids. We can still, if we talk to kids at a youth group, or if we're involved in our church or on campus, and having prayer. One of the things I do with my kids on our way to school is we pray together. We pray together every day on our way to school. And we pray that, I pray that you learn what, God wants you to learn today, that you have kindness today for somebody. If you see somebody that's not happy, you share a smile or some other kind words or whatever it is. And so we pray before we go to school every day. So even though they're at a public school, they can bring that. And having not had this growing up, and then my husband, who was the one that brought me to Christ, and it changed my life. It completely changed my life. And boy, I'm so happy I had God going through college, because that really made a difference, and still does, of course. And I think that even if somebody's in a public school system and they don't have some of those opportunities to maybe have live prayer or have chaplains and all these things that are on campuses or even in schools, religious schools, we can still set our kids up, our nieces, our nephews, or maybe children that we're working with in the school systems. If we know they have particular spiritual beliefs, we can support those things, and that can absolutely make a difference. I know even when I was test taking, I would pray before I would take a test. If I didn't know an answer, I would stop and I would breathe and I would pray. And we just need to calm down and listen. So I think it's, regardless of what the setting is, prayer can certainly provide a positive aspect in our educational experience. And of course, exercise and learning. Exercise has such a profound effect on learning. And we've talked a little bit about this, and I'm just going to share just a little bit. And I love this statement from the CDC. Physical activity can have an impact on cognitive skills and attitudes and academic behavior, all of which are important components of improved academic performance. These include enhanced concentration and attention, as well as improved classroom behavior. But of course, this goes so deep because of the way exercise changes the brain, specifically that seat of learning and memory, that can have a huge impact on our ability to learn and retain information. So when we look at some of the research, this is just a couple studies, and there have been a number of studies looking at physical activity. This one is just looking at fitness score. So you know how schools will do fitness testing? Well, they compared fitness level to academics. In this particular study, you can see math and reading scores were higher in the more physically fit. So we see the number of fitness standards achieved. So the more fitness standards that were achieved, the higher the test scores were. And again, this is something that's seen in numerous studies. So some of the ways that exercise does this we've talked about, but it really prepares those nerve cells to bind more easily and stronger. It increases the neurotransmitter activity, increases those growth factors, that brain-derived neurotrophic factor, that miracle growth for the brain. This is just one. There are a number of other growth factors that also are increased from the muscles through that contraction of the muscle, and improved blood flow. So exercise is really, really helpful, and it saddens me, as we talked about in class, that it's being really dismantled in our schools, even at the recess. And of course, as I mentioned in my kids' school, and I know a number of other schools this has happened as well, is the lack of even being able to run during recess. So kids really, really need this. And just to look a little bit more of this, of course, again, exercise improves attention, it improves motivation, and part of this is by increasing chemicals like dopamine, norepinephrine, but it also helps to reduce those thoughts that are kind of racing. It helps to control those rapid fire reactions. We see more anxiety relief, we see higher self-esteem, we see a reduction in learned helplessness, we see improved resilience and better able to handle stress. So our kids really need this. Can I say that enough? One of the other things that's so valuable with those neural connections that are made with exercise, again, we increase neuroplasticity, or we increase neurogenesis, so creation of more neurons, and also the connection between those neurons. And it's these connections that are created during exercise can actually be used by other areas in life. It's not just for exercise, and they can be used for thinking. So this is why when you see some of things like piano, which is also, I mean, there's a lot more than just the physical movement, of course, that's going on with piano, but you see people that play piano, kids tend to learn, learning math tends to be easier. And part of it is because of that way that the brain is affected by those motor movements. And the prefrontal cortex, that PFC, can apply these situations and these connections. And if you think about how we learn complex skills, for example, let's say ballet or the asanas during yoga, gymnastics, Pilates, karate, all of these engage nerve cells throughout the brain because they're complex. So doing complex skills is really, really helpful for our brain, not just walking, which is still great. Even just moderate amounts of exercise lead to neurogenesis and brain-derived neurotrophic factor and all these wonderful positive pleasure chemicals. But the complex stuff is really, really helpful. And when you look at studies of dancers, when they're doing more irregular rhythms, they have more brain neuroplasticity compared to just real simple or regular rhythm. Now I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about health literacy. So health literacy, and this is one of those slides, I gave you guys the web address for this, the American Academy of Family Physicians, and they have so many wonderful presentations and things, so I just pulled from a couple of theirs that they already had beautifully done. So this is just the definition of health literacy. It's the degree to which individuals have the capacity to obtain, process, and understand basic health information and services needed to make appropriate health decisions. So health literacy, that includes basic skills like reading, writing, numeracy, communication, understanding electronic technology. I talked about a patient that I had years ago, and he couldn't read. So it was really challenging for him, and it was one that he would, after he felt comfortable and he confided about this, but he had all these skills that he had created to help him deal with his lack of literacy. But it can be really scary, especially as I was talking about with medications and not being able to read something correctly, or even think about understanding electronic technology. I get regular blood draws, and so I'm always in the Quest Diagnostic, and now you have there's never anybody up at the counter. You just have to sign in electronically. And so often people come in and they just stand there and they don't know what to do. Part of it sometimes can be the literacy, part of it is just that fear of technology. There's obviously a number of things that could be leading to that, but I see it every single time I go in. And I'm always sitting up close to that, and I'll ask somebody, do you need some help with this? But there's just never anybody, a person there to help. So this is something that's really challenging. And I think even just from something as simple as that, it's not going to affect health. It could provoke stress, which isn't good. But, just the fact that they end up waiting so much longer because they can't sign in. So even little things like that can be more challenging. And you saw this slide before, but 9 out of 10 adults may not possess the skills they need to manage their health and prevent disease. And that's a lot. So when we look at low health literacy, approximately 80 million Americans have limited health literacy. 80 million Americans, which puts them at greater risk for poor access to health care. And of course, if we have less access and less understanding, we have poorer health outcomes. And low health literacy is also associated with poor health outcomes and not just the health outcomes, but also just poor use of the healthcare services, which of course would contribute to poorer health outcomes. So when we have patients with low, or if we're working with people that have lower health literacy, they may not comprehend, again, things like drug labeling, medical instructions, and there's potential for problems and people just following recommendations. So even if you're working at a health clinic, we need to know what people are understanding, because a lot of times they'll just nod their head and they'll just act like they know what they're talking, but then they really don't. And I've had so many people bring in their bag of medications when we had cardiac rehab, and they had no idea what they were taking, literally no idea what they were taking. They had like 10 different medications. They didn't know what they were taking. They didn't know why they were taking them. So we need to really be able to talk to people and find out where they're at. So who's at risk? Of course, those that have lower education, if there's a language barrier, certain cultures, access to resources, their age, these are all factors that can lead to problems with health literacy. So especially older adults, racial and ethnic minorities, non-native speaking, people that don't speak English, people with less than a high school degree or a GED certificate, people with low income levels, and people with compromised health status, which of course can affect cognition too. So when we look at those skills that people need for health literacy, that's being able to evaluate information. They need to be able to analyze risks and benefits. They need to be able to understand dosage calculations, understand and interpret their test results, so that when the doctor's talking to them or they have a clue of what they're talking about. Locate health information, know where to find it, and even know how to learn and study about something, to read about something, to learn about their condition, because that knowledge gives them power and more control over what's happening. So they're not just blindly following what somebody else is saying, but that they have some say in what's going on. So you have to have some health literacy to be able to do that, obviously. Understanding visual information, calculating, and having, basic reasoning, numerical reasoning. Now, when we look at the language barrier, this is a really big issue, and I mentioned the first day I've been talking about my experience working in cardiac rehab. One of the facilities or the medical groups that I worked for in downtown Los Angeles, and we had a lot of Spanish-speaking patients. Now, I was able to communicate enough and ask certain questions about, of course, blood pressure, if they had chest pain, if they were short of breath, and all of those kinds of questions. But, beyond that, I was at a loss. And if they needed to communicate, if they were trying to communicate with me, I was at a loss. So, when we look at practices, whether it's a medical establishment or a health clinic, or even, settings in public facilities that have health talks or what have you, this is something we need to have people that are trained. Many of you probably speak 2 languages. I love, my husband's fluent in Spanish, and I've been saying I would learn it. I mean, I took it in high school, but that's clearly not enough to be fluent. And I've still meant to do it for all these years, and I still haven't. But hopeful my kids will have Spanish, because we need it here. But anyway, so you know, you have to determine the needs of the for services. Oh man, let's just start. Okay, let's jump into employment now. I'm going to start with unemployment. So when we're not employed, that of course has a lot of negative health consequences. People that are unemployed have higher feelings of depression, anxiety, low self-esteem. They feel demoralized. They have more worry, of course, anxiety, and also physical pain. And we also see a number of not just emotional aspects to unemployment, but of course the real physical aspects that typically are going to be a result, at least partially, of stress. The stress that this places on an individual can increase hypertension or high blood pressure, stroke, cardiovascular disease or coronary heart disease, myocardial infarction, so heart attack, arthritis. These are all conditions that are increased in people that have been unemployed. Now, the good news is that at least since 2000, we have seen the unemployment go down in the United States, in California, and then we have data here also within Orange County. We know that employment helps us to flourish. We've talked about this the first day. It helps us to flourish. Those higher levels of life satisfaction, increased income and financial stability, increased likelihood of marriage with all its protections, as long as it's a good one, family and marital satisfaction. We see better mental and physical health, fewer hospitalizations. It helps to explain some variations in that life purpose. I know I mentioned this for me. I mean, my life purpose is to help people. That's it. That's it. So I'm so blessed to be able to work in professions that allow me to do that and fulfill my mission in life. And of course, having employment reduces crime and just overall increases the quality of our life. And you saw this stress slide before as well. One of the negatives of work, I mean, overall, if we have work, it tends to protect us. But if we have jobs where we have a lack of decision making, we see things like cardiovascular disease increase. If we have pressures that go beyond what we're capable of, it's not matching our knowledge, our abilities, we start to see, of course, more stress. If you have an insane boss, I mentioned my husband worked with a producer that every single day she would make somebody cry, and it was kind of interesting, and that's coming to mind again just because he's working with another producer that is having a similar effect on people. And a friend of his that he recommended to this position is saying how somebody just had a stroke at the office, somebody just died. I mean, it's like he was saying, it's like it's jinxed. This I'm not sure what it is, if it's like a television show or what, but it was like there's so many people that are just it's like they're dropping like flies at this place. And he was saying just the stress even just coming onto this job is crazy. And he mentioned there's a producer that's kind of like this gal that my husband worked with that just makes people cry like all the time. So that kind of an environment clearly is not good for our health. And when we look at some of the research looking at heart disease, again, specifically, we see that having a job, technically, for the most part, is better than not having a job, but we also have to look at the details of what's going on and looking at social organization, management style, social relationships within that work community. And health decreases as we have reduced opportunity, if our skills aren't being used, if we feel like our talents aren't being used, if we have low control, if we have very controlling, micromanaging managers. And so we see a strong association between little work control, coronary heart disease, back pain, which is really interesting. Back pain, there's associations between back pain and depression. But we have more sickness and absences, and there are independent psychological characteristics as well. We see more anxiety and other side effects from the stress. And of course, if the demands are high and control issues, we see that these are interacting. And of course, high demanding jobs with little control also are increasing risk. And so we can see, of course, in our graph here, when somebody feels that they have a lack of control, then the risk goes up when somebody has low control. And of course, social support in the workplace is really important. If we don't feel like we have that social support, I mean, we're spending a huge part of our lives at work. If we don't have that social support, then that contributes obviously to stress. And for some people, it's having that ability to come down from that stress after work is also creating more risk factors or increasing risk factors like blood pressure not coming down after stressful work environments. And of course, inadequate rewards. So if we don't get any kind of praise, not necessarily money compensation, because a lot of people, the money compensation may not be the end all, but it's just that esteem and getting the recognition for working really hard and doing something. Getting that praise. It's like a kid getting a sticker, right? We need that. We need that sticker. We need some positive reinforcement for what we're doing. And if we're not getting any of that, and of course you compound that with some of the other things of the demands of a job and control and all of those other things, it just compounds it. But we do see increased cardiovascular disease when we're getting inadequate rewards for our work. Another area that is linked to increased anxiety, depression, poor health, cardiovascular disease, and more cardiovascular disease risk factors is job insecurity. Now, if we have job security, it actually increases health. It increases well-being and job satisfaction. But when we don't have job security, it creates a lot of stress. And of course, that risk, or not that risk, but that fear of unemployment. I mean, my husband's industry, working in television, he's in finance, so sometimes his job may be more secure in some ways than some others, but holy moly, that industry is insane. It's crazy. And there's always just this, like, you just don't know. You don't know if you're going to have a job, if the show is going to get canceled, or if a production company doesn't sell enough shows, then they close. So there's a lot of that feeling of insecurity, job insecurity that's wrapped around certain industries. And so we know, of course, unemployment causes higher rates of illness and premature death in unemployed people and their families. That's the other thing, I didn't mention that earlier, but also in their families. But the health effects due to the psychological and the financial aspects of job insecurity or unemployment are very real and lead to, as I mentioned, a number of poor health outcomes. But part of that could be due to those coping mechanisms. Oftentimes when we feel that sense of stress or that insecurity, what do? When that lower part of the brain is kind of taking over, those hedonic pleasures seem very appealing. And that's smoking and drinking, or maybe even overspending in a time where you need to be saving. So all of those excessive behaviors we engage in because they give us that dopamine kick. They make us feel better in that temporary or transient time period. But of course, they end up causing more problems in the long run and harm our health even more. Of course, one of the benefits of employment is having benefits, right? I mentioned how my husband and I, because we both are independent contractors and have our own businesses, and we don't have health insurance, we have to pay out of pocket, which is crazy expensive. And so if we have a good job with a good employment and good benefits, that's huge. It's really huge as we get older and we actually need to use some of those resources. Unlike when maybe we're 20 and we just don't really have a lot of healthcare needs, unless we have injury, like a car accident or something, of course, then it comes obviously handy. But jobs have health insurance. We have paid sick leave. Some places, depending on the company, you get more, you get less. And if you're not a full-time employee, what you get is usually not that great. But also having parental leave, depending on what the company provides. Some companies are going to say, let's say care for maternity leave. It's like, okay, you got your 6 weeks and that's it. You're back to work. Whereas other companies and the higher up, of course, this is where having a good education and getting a higher paying job and being able to work at a really nice company, you get a lot of benefits from that. I was able to save up my all my vacation. I saved up all my vacation. I saved up, I had already, I had a cesarean, so I had 8 weeks off. Legally full pay, and then I had additional time where I got paid, oh gosh, I can't remember, it's like half pay or something like that. And then I think there was a time where I got like no pay, but I still, based on my employer, I was able to take off a full 5 months of work. So it was really wonderful to be able to have that time to be at home. And although there was some financial struggle because I wasn't getting, towards the end, I was not getting paid full, but we had saved up prior to the birth. We had really worked hard to save a lot before that happened. I don't know how we did that, but we really did it. And now we were in that we had the ability to do that based on our education, based on an employment status, and all of that. Whereas, of course, a lot of people don't have those benefits. But this is really important when we look at, two key functions of health insurance are, access to affordable medical care and financial protection from those unexpected healthcare costs. And having that paid sick leave is an important benefit. Some employers, they allow employees to seek medical care for themselves or their dependent family members, without losing wages. And then, of course, some employers offer really, like I was saying, really great maternity care. And not only do we get maternity care, but paternity leave. So some companies will provide really nice paternity leave. Of course, other countries provide ample amounts of maternity and paternity leave. I think we need more policies around some of this because we see how beneficial it is to children. Even just that connection, we were talking about that connection, even listening to babbling and responding to babbling, and that warmth and that care from the parent is really important for the development of the baby, even at those first weeks and months. Now, also looking at health and employment, we look at the type of job. We've talked a little bit about this, but we're looking at the fatal injuries in workplaces. And I remember at my last office, there was an electrician who got electrocuted while at work, and it was, God, that was so scary. And I didn't witness it or anything, but it was just heart-wrenching to hear about. So, different types of jobs, obviously there's more fatal injuries, and not just fatal injuries, but injuries in different types of jobs. And this is why we see some of those links between lower education and the types of employment that somebody with less education might get, where we have more heavy lifting, repetitive lifting, pulling and pushing heavy loads, even if you just look at, and this isn't with those types of jobs, but even an office job where there's a lot of just poor quality office equipment, or the way somebody's sitting. My sister-in-law actually got very injured working at Kaiser behind a desk because the desk setup was so awful. She ended up not only getting carpal tunnel, but she ended up getting an injury in her neck, and she's had to have multiple surgeries because of this that stemmed from a poor work setup. So the way you sit when you're working and all of those ergonomic things make a big difference. But then also looking at our exposure, certain types of jobs. I mentioned maybe being in around chemicals, so aerosols, asbestos, pesticides, lead, and even noisy environments. All of these can create more stress, not only the exposure to the chemicals, which can create more oxidative stress, which can cause, of course, more damage, cell structure, and DNA, and we create more mutated cells and all of that, going back to the stress lecture. But we see different types of employment lead to different types of health outcomes. And also, of course, there's some differences looking at gender. Men tend to be more likely to work longer hours, have higher status jobs, have more physically demanding jobs, and receive less support from coworkers and supervisors. So although the one piece in here is having a higher status job, that's a plus, but some of these others are not so great and can create more stress. And of course, women, they report more work-related physical and mental health problems, experiencing more sexual harassment, and are more related alcohol abuse. So of course, there can be some disparities in the workplace based on race and ethnicity. For example, we see that white people are more likely to work in white-collar jobs, managerial jobs, versus African American people who are more likely to work in blue-collar jobs. We see that African Americans, there's 21% of African Americans work in jobs that put them at higher risk for injury or illness, compared to only 13% of white Americans. And we see that, of course, there can be inequalities among different racial and ethnic minorities, which can lead to more stress, more anxiety, depression, and even physical pain. We'll talk more about some of these as we move into other lectures. There's not as much research looking at cancer. I've seen more on cardiovascular disease, of course, and metabolic dysregulation or metabolic diseases. But there is some research that has looked at work stress and the risk of cancer. And in this particular study published in the International Journal of Cancer very recently, they found there was a significant association between work stress and the risk of a few different types of cancer, including colorectal cancer, lung cancer, and esophageal cancer. And they found statistical significant effects of work stress on colorectal cancer in North American participants versus a non-significant relationship in Europeans. So that was kind of interesting. So the populations differed. So probably some kind of a genetic effect that may be more protective in one population versus another, or maybe something in the environment. But they did see a significant association between work stress and esophageal cancer in those in Europe, but not in North America. So again, there was increased risk of cancers, but it was a little bit different in the different study participants. And in addition, they did not observe any difference or association, I should say, between work stress and risk of prostate, breast, or ovarian cancers. So again, the findings of the study showed work stress was an important risk factor for colorectal cancer, lung cancer, and esophageal cancer, but it varied somewhat depending on the population. And as I just mentioned, there's research looking at metabolic dysregulation as well due to stress, which clearly affects our endocrine system and, of course, our immune system. And we look at that HPA axis, and we look at how it affects our physical being. And we see that, of course, when we have elevated cholesterol, we see more inflammation, and inflammation is tied to each piece of the metabolic syndrome, each characteristic. Again, we're looking at things like elevated glucose, we're looking at dyslipidemia, we're looking at waist circumference, elevated blood pressure. So we're looking at these 5 criteria. So elevated triglycerides and low HDL. Again, that's the lipidemia piece. So with high cholesterol, we see also elevated insulin levels. But in the studies looking specifically at work stress, we see this alteration in the autonomic nervous system. So that stress response, we start to see some imbalance in that parasympathetic side of the nervous system versus the sympathetic side of the nervous system. So we see a reduced heart rate variability. Remember, that heart rate variability is that interval between heartbeats. We want that to be increased because that shows that we have more balance between those two sides of that autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic side of the nervous system. We want that parasympathetic side of the nervous system to be robust, right? So that we can recover when we have a bout of stress, we can recover quickly, like the zebras, right? And the stress, of course, creates that more inflammation. We see higher markers of inflammation like C-reactive protein, and then of course those other variables found within that metabolic syndrome: lower HDL cholesterol, elevated glucose levels, altered insulin levels, and of course when we have increased metabolic syndrome, or when we have metabolic syndrome, that increases our risk of other diseases like cardiovascular disease and diabetes. And here we go, diabetes. So of course, we see increased risk of type 2 diabetes, so excessive overtime. In this particular study, this was looking at Japanese men. They found that excessive overtime, we were talking about that being overworked, right? Men oftentimes putting in more hours. Well, here's a study that's seeing that increased fourfold increased risk of type 2 diabetes in these Japanese men that had excessive overtime. And of course, this imbalance in that effort reward. We're talking about that too. We need that if we're putting in hard work, we really need to have that reward. We need a reward to pay off that we're putting in this time and this effort, and we're working hard. So that imbalance there put them at higher risk, or put people at higher risk for type 2 diabetes. And this is seen in that Whitehall 2 prospective study. Of course, you've seen the Whitehall study. It's huge. There's so much data from this study that you've seen, I'm sure, in your textbook, but I've mentioned a few things as well throughout the course. But tense working situations also are associated with the onset of diabetes, and on average 5 years, and in women, but not in men in a large population-based studies. So tense working situations seem to have more of an impact on the female gender with regards to diabetes. And what about burnout? If we're overworking, we're not getting reward, we're tired all the time, we're bringing stress home, we see more burnout. And of course, there's certain types of jobs, caregiving jobs, whether it's nursing, whether it's even taking care of family members, if you're a caretaker taking care of family members, but helping professions, psychologists. We know, even looking at data with physicians, there's a higher suicide rate in physicians. And part of this can relate to some of the attributes of burnout and chronic work stress. But in this particular study that I've got presented here, burnout from chronic work stress has been associated also with type 2 diabetes. So we create that metabolic dysregulation when we have high stress. And so that stress, of course, coming from work in this situation. So longitudinal studies have looked at men, they've looked at women, and they found higher baseline burnout symptoms were associated with the development of type 2 diabetes. And again, looking at that Whitehall 2 study data, they showed work stress was associated with increased risk. So psychological stress at work was an independent predictor of type 2 diabetes in females. And this was during that Whitehall study of a 15-year follow-up. We can also look at the workplace justice. If somebody feels like there's justice in the workplace, like let's say there's an issue and there's a confrontation and somebody feels like there's no justice, like it wasn't fair, whatever happens. If we feel like there's high work justice, then that actually decreases that HPA axis dysregulation. So we are protected. However, if we don't have that and we have that stress response, we create more dysregulation, then we have actually greater risk of metabolic syndrome. So men that perceived a high level of justice at the workplace had a 25% lower risk of developing metabolic syndrome than men that perceived a low level of justice in the workplace. And here's a questionnaire that assesses workplace justice. So you can take a look at that if you're interested. And here's a little quiz question looking at sick days. We look at different countries: Ireland, Sweden, France, Spain, Portugal, and other Western European nations all mandate by law paid holiday and vacations for 4 to 6 weeks. Can you imagine? I can't even imagine a 6 week paid vacation. How amazing would that be? But how many days of paid vacation are mandated by laws in the US? None, 10, or 12? I'm pausing. I'm letting you think before I give you the answer. I'm sure you already know it. If you work, you know the answer to this. Guess what? It's none. The United States is the only, and stress that, only rich country that does not guarantee any paid vacation nor any paid sick days by law. Companies will do it, but it's not by law. And 47% of private sector employees must choose between going to work sick and staying home and losing a day's pay. So this is something that we need to change policy, because personally, and I was really a lot more upset about this when I was pregnant. That I'm like, I had a friend of mine at my office came to work with pneumonia. And I'm like, are you flipping kidding me? Please go home. And normally that might have annoyed me because I don't want to catch it. But being pregnant, I was like, you got to stay the heck away from me with that. So it spreads illness throughout the company, the workforce. So, this is something that really needs to change. And of course, going to sick work just makes us end up more stressed and angry and dislike our employer, and then we're more miserable at our job. So it's just and they don't get the best work out of people when this kind of stuff happens. So part of it is the culture, because some of us think, oh, I go to sick work, I'm look at me, and we get praise for it, like we're like such a trooper. So to a degree, staying home when you have a cold is ridiculous, but when somebody's really sick, we need to change these laws. We need this, in my opinion. So what can we do? Well, we can get involved. Tell Congress to support paid sick leave and family leave. Not allowing workers to take time off when they're sick can have serious consequences to public health. Of course, spreading disease, and you look at children. I was mentioning just minor things, but you look at children that aren't vaccinated today, and you look at now, if we're in the public schools, we have to have some vaccinations. But people sometimes, if they're not in certain settings and they don't get that, we see spread of diseases that we thought were gone. Workers without paid sick leaves are faced with obviously really difficult decisions every time that they or loved ones are sick and have to either stay home or go to work and have money to feed your kids and your family. So today, more than 37 million private sector U.S. workers have no access to a single day. 37 million private sector U.S. workers have no access to a single day of paid sick leave, forcing them to compromise their health, compromise the health of others in the community, or get paid. And when you live paycheck to paycheck, you need that paycheck. So this is, despite the fact that research has shown that paid sick leave actually has little to or no effect on the business. So this is it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. We need to fix this. If you're interested in getting involved in some of these things, some of these really important public health issues, go to the American Public Health Association. If you're not a member, if you can, become a member. There are student discounts to getting involved, but there's so much information on the website. Even if you can't become a member, there's still a lot of access that you can get, a lot of material you can get access to. So here's just a page that was Tell Congress to support paid sick leave, and it helps you to kind of navigate some of this so that we can start creating some change here. So when we start thinking about some of these things from the work perspective and the workplace, of course, those of you, there are several of you that are involved, have been involved, or are interested in getting into policy. This is a really important one. Of course, I say that about everything because I think everything's important. But getting involved and finding, having involved decision making that's likely to help benefit employees at all levels of an organization. And having procedures, they should be implemented to allow people to influence their work environments, having more control, having greater variety, more development of opportunities. Even ergonomically appropriate workplaces. So, like my sister-in-law isn't in some corner with a computer at some really strange angle, and people are taking notice and creating legal controls and health services within the workplace to support people's health, not only in immediate health, but of course long term. So 3 goals of policy: prevent unemployment and job insecurity, reduce hardships suffered by employed, restore people to secure jobs. I'm just rattling these off, but of course, it's not quite that simple as just stating it. But it really, I think a lot of it just comes down to people getting involved. So if there's something that you find particularly within the social determinants of health that you're really compelled towards or passionate about, get involved and go to the American Public Health Association website and see where you can get involved with possibly policy and creating even some grassroots movements. But looking at limiting work hours, everybody today, we have these just insane schedules and we're on call 24/7 with our devices today. There's just no break, and we need to change this because it's really hurting our people, our communities, and our country because we don't take breaks. And of course, the unemployment benefits, we can see improving education even within the workforce and having training seminars and things that can retrain people or get people trained to move into other positions. Credit unions may help by decreasing debts and increasing social networks. So there's a number of things that we can get involved in, and as public health professionals try to direct people to in this area. Holy moly, we made it. We did it. Thanks everybody for hanging in there. I know that's a lot. Without video, so I was having some problems with my camera. I don't know what was going on, but I hope you hung in there. Anyway, have a wonderful week and take care.